Hey everyone, I'm here with David Simiele. No, it's
Simiele. Yeah, that's it.
We joked around a lot about his last name, but you always are smiling. You have so much joy, full of life, and blessed to be able to come together today and talk about culture.
Yeah.
But before we do that, can you just give us a little heads up of who you are? Thank you for letting us pronounce your name correctly.
Yes, yeah, that's so important to get the pronunciation of that Italian name right. Man, I've known Dan now, or Daniel, I don't know if it's Dan or Daniel, for just a couple of years. We did some ministry kind of close together down in the south part of our county for a while before I transitioned to another campus location. I've been in full-time ministry for about 18 years. In the last 9.5 years, had the privilege of serving right here in Palm Beach County at Christ Fellowship Church, a multi-site church in our county, and been on staff at a couple different campuses. And that's how I got connected with you. And what I love is that we're part of this movement called Church United. Yeah. And Church United is church leaders from all different backgrounds and faith expressions and philosophy of ministry, but the essentials are the same, and we're linked arm in arm to see transformation in our region. So I love what God's doing in Delray, and I'm excited about what God's doing right here in Palm Beach Gardens and what God's doing wherever you are.
Yeah. And so today I thought it would be a great thing to talk to you about culture, because you work at a fairly larger church with multiple campuses. You have to be strategic. You have to be on point with your values, with creating good communications and systems to make sure everyone's on the same page. And so we're going to talk about culture today. We're going to talk about how do you create that in your teams? How do you just be able to lead groups of people to do some great things. So let's first define culture. How would you describe culture? What is culture?
You know, I think too that over the last couple of years, like, culture is this buzzword, right? Yeah. And so Merriam-Webster, when you get on their website, you can actually look at what are some of the most Googled words or searched words. And just a couple of years ago, culture was at the top of that list. And I think culture is kind of like this. It's hard to define, but easy to experience. Yeah. So hard to define, but easy to experience. Think about Chick-fil-A. Like, they have a culture at Chick-fil-A that is just for service, what they call second mile, second nature. When you go to Disney, there is a culture of Disney. Hard to define, but what I love about Disney, you never see their employees eating when you go around. And you might not live in South Florida or get a chance to go to Orlando, but Disney employees, I don't know when they eat, I don't know when they use the restroom, but you never see them in those places. Yeah. They don't do that. Disney has a culture. And so while it is hard to define, easy to experience, and we all have a culture. Mm-hmm. You have a culture. You have a family culture. Yep. You have a church culture. I have a family culture. I have a church culture. Internationally, different cultures. And so I think one of the ways that it can be defined, actually, Pastor Sam Chan wrote a book a couple of years ago called Cracking Your Church's Culture Code, and actually just came out with an updated version of that book. And in there, he says that culture is how you do what you want to accomplish. How you do things is how he defines it. Another definition of culture that I like is from a mentor friend of mine. His name's Lance Witt. Lance defines culture this way. He says, the collective personality of an organization composed of assumptions, beliefs, traditions, values, and attitudes. And so culture it doesn't have to be this thing that's mystical and that you can't define. It's just easier to experience than it is to define. But we all have a culture, and all of our churches have a culture. And I'm excited about this kind of interview today as we talk about the importance of culture and what it means for our leadership.
Yeah, and so let's dig deeper into that. Why is it important for you to identify your culture in your local church as a leader, and to just know how to impact your culture in the local church?
Yeah, we talk about culture a lot at our church, and I'm sure you do at yours as well. And culture for us is something that absolutely needs to be defined and measured. And I think some people go, well, yeah, we know our mission and we know our vision, but mission and vision, they're important to execute culture. But if you don't have the right culture, you won't be able to execute that mission and vision that God has given you for your church. I was just in a meeting earlier this week, and some people, because we have not figured out everything about culture, by the way, and the kind of church culture.
Are you sure?
We are not the perfect church, Dan. We're not.
Okay.
But Redemption Hill, they've got culture figured out.
I will say this, Christ Fellowship is amazing at culture. They are just, you could tell when you're around Christ Fellowship people, they're always encouraging, they're loving, they're supportive.
Thank you.
That's one of the reasons why I did want to interview you about culture, because I feel like you guys express who you are in multiple ways and multiple locations so well and so good.
And I think the reason why we're able to do that, and again, it's not. I'll get back to why it's not perfect, but I think the reason why we've been able to do that is because we have clearly defined our mission, our vision, and our values. We have 5 values at Christ Fellowship, what we call core values, and then we have 10 leadership values that we teach our staff and our volunteers on a regular basis. We'll talk more about that. I can make those available in the show notes as well. But because we're so clear on mission, vision, and values, that allows us to have what I would say are gates to our culture. And so because we have that kind of clarity, we know what we want to keep in and we know what we want to keep out. And we want there to be congruence between what we say and what people experience. Like, we can't say, one of our favorite phrases here at Christ Fellowship is welcome home. We can't say welcome home and then when you show up unannounced be like, what are you doing here? You know? And so many times I think pastors feel like they're getting interrupted by a drop-in or a phone call that they weren't expecting, that kind of thing. But for us, I mean, you could show up at home anytime. And so when people come and there's not an appointment, there's not a schedule, our facial body language, our tone with them, all needs to express that welcome home, we're glad you're here kind of experience with people. And
that's good.
I think part of that too is, like, I know my responsibility as a campus pastor, and this is true for senior pastors, leaders in the church, that we are what I call CCOs. We are Chief Culture Officers. We are CCOs. And you might be like, I've never had a CCO title before. You've got it now. You are the Chief Culture Officer wherever you worship, wherever you lead, wherever you work. And because of that, you're owning it and you're communicating that culture. Now, in my role, I lead in what some people call a second chair position, right? And so our senior leaders, they have collectively and collaboratively defined what our mission, values, and vision are for our church. So I don't get to create culture. I'm a culture carrier. And as a CCO, my job is to carry the culture and to be one of those gatekeepers, to protect the culture, to make sure it's there. And the other thing I would say is that, like, I think it's my responsibility and our staff's responsibility to stir the culture. Here's what I mean about stir the culture. My wife grew up in Virginia. She's a Southern Belle, and she makes incredible sweet tea. But there's a secret to sweet tea. You got to stir the sugar, and you got to stir the sugar long enough that all that sugar dissolves throughout that sweet tea. The best sweet tea has been stirred appropriately, and it's the same thing with culture. The best organizations that have culture, they are constantly stirring the sugar, making sure that everybody in the organization, whether it's in the walls of the church or outside the church, is living up to the culture that's been defined.
Yeah, and I could see you stirring the sugar all over. Even when I came into your office, waiting, looking around the lobby, all that stuff, I could see the values are up. I dropped in on someone, they welcomed me, like all that different stuff. What are some ways that you express the culture, express your values to people that may not be coming to the leadership meetings, may not be coming to, be a part of the church for a year, but they're brand new? How do you express the culture to those people?
Yeah, I would say we are expressing culture intentionally in almost everything we do, if not everything we do. So every weekend you come to Christ Fellowship, you're going to hear something related to the mission of our church. Here's our mission. We are called to impact our world with the love and message of Jesus Christ, everyone, every day, everywhere. And so you're going to hear that either in the message, you're going to hear that in an inspirational moment in the service. As we tell stories of transformation, you're going to hear that. Vision. We have a heart and a dream to see radical transformation in our region. And I've already used the word transformation with Dan. And we're linked arm in arm with Church United for radical transformation in our region. And we know that's bigger than our church. We've got to work with partner churches. We've got to work with other people in the community to see that. And so you're going to hear it on platforms. You're going to read it on signs. You saw it on the walls. Yep. It's posted. It's printed on T-shirts. It's on coffee mugs. It's everywhere we are. And so I think people, they can't always articulate it, but when they do articulate it and they haven't been here long enough, that's when we know we win. And those are the kinds of things we celebrate as a staff. And so when people come and they've been here for a couple of weeks and they go, man, it just feels like family. We're like, oh my word, we didn't plant the word family, but that's exactly the heart that we have, because we believe that church isn't a building you walk into, but it's a family you belong to. And so when people start saying that and having that, and that we didn't plant that seed, it's just coming out of them, that's when we know that we're communicating the kind of culture, the place that we want to be.
Yeah, and having a healthy culture is so important. I've heard it say that culture trumps strategy all the time.
Yeah.
Just 100%.
Yeah, right. Peter Drucker, he's the guy that said that culture eats strategy for lunch, and it is so important that we recognize the importance of culture. But what I think, again, has been the reason why culture is something that we've been known for, or people want to learn the Christ Fellowship way, or the kind of culture that we have, is because we have clear mission, vision, and values. And those mission, vision, and values, by the way, that was a corporate decision. I think what happens is sometimes leaders isolate themselves.
Yeah.
They spend time with the Lord. They had the purest heart of intention, and they go, okay, this is the kind of church we want to be. And this isolated solo leader defines the kind of church that they want to be, or the kind of ministry that they want to have. And then they go and they sell that to a group of people who didn't get an opportunity to buy in. They didn't get an opportunity to collaborate. They didn't get an opportunity to say, "Oh, that's me," or "Yeah, that's what I want to be a part of." And so, having a collaborative culture is going to help people own the mission, own the vision and values, which is going to allow for that maximum impact. It is so important, and people are attracted to it.
Yeah,
I think this is why. People go to all different sizes of churches. People go to all different expressions of churches. People sacrifice maybe a worship experience or even a teaching experience to be a part of a church culture that meets how they're wired and attracts them to be a part of that. There is a study in Forbes magazine that was talking about the importance of culture in organizations, and in the study they talked about that people, the 20% of leaders that you would want, the highest capacity leaders, what they're more attracted to than compensation, more than the bottom line, more than what they're going to make, is the kind of company culture that they're going to be a part of. And so culture is so important. This is why people are choosing to worship in whatever church you're leading, and the churches that we're leading, is because the culture that we've created there.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is culture is very important, so you're intentional.
Yeah.
You're intentional about even how you come up with your mission, your vision, your values, to do it with people so there's buy-in. And because, you're the gatekeeper of the culture, you're the leader, but yet you realize that you're not the only one. There's multiple people on your team, on your staff. And so how do you impart the values and the system and the culture to help them pick up that mantle and help you create culture as well?
Yeah. Our senior leaders have charged us with this idea, again, of stirring the sugar. But in every staff meeting, I don't have to pray about a devotional thought or idea to bring to our team. I know I'm going to teach on one of our core values, or I'm going to teach on one of our leader values. And I may do that in a different way. So we've got a core value at our church that's called inside out. And so inside out means that we're going to steward our lives with integrity, right? And so we're going to live from the inside out, integrity and prayer. And so I'm going to talk about Joseph in the Old Testament. And we're going to just talk about the commitments that he made in his heart, that when Potiphar's wife came after, he had already made the decision what he was going to do. Joseph was an inside out kind of leader. And so I'm going to talk about Joseph, but I'm going to put in our core value. And so every staff meeting, we're talking about vision and values. And then in our staff, we actually have a system that we can do reviews. And I don't know how that works for you at your church or your one-on-ones with your team and what you do with the staff or high capacity volunteers that you're leading, is that those mission, vision, and values are a part of our conversations and a part of our reviews. So we do annual reviews here. We measure how a person is living out our core values. And then if there's a corrective conversation, which is sometimes a hard conversation for pastors, but we need to be having them. In fact, if you're not having corrective conversations with staff or volunteers, I'd encourage you that I think part of discipleship is the discipline. And it's those what we would call discipleship conversations, that we need to go somewhere with a leader to maybe reveal a blind spot, or potentially even a sin issue, a blind spot that has led to a sin issue, whatever that may be. But when we have a corrective conversation, we are using our core values and our leadership values as hey, we have a spirit of grow to go. That's another one of our core values here. And if someone is saying, I don't need that meeting, I don't need that training, I've already been through that before, like, hey, our value of grow to go, remaining teachable to be usable, you've got to be a part of these trainings. And that's who we are. Yeah. And because that's so defined, I think sometimes too, even in our interview process and as people are coming on for membership and to be a part of our church, they hear that and they're either attracted to that culture, or they're like, I don't know that this is the place for me. I don't know that I can live all these things out. But it's very attractive when a church has that defined culture, because it closes to the gaps and the cracks. Started earlier talking about a crack in our culture. So just this week I was in a meeting and someone was like, hey, I've been trying to volunteer here for 6 months and here's 6 different things that happened during my experience of trying to volunteer here. And the bottom line through all that person's attempts to volunteer and to get involved was a lack of communication on our end. But what I love is that this individual didn't fall into a gaping hole, but she fell into a crack. We can save people that are slipping into the cracks. She brought it to our attention. That's not our culture. We can fix cracks. But if we had a gaping hole that people were falling into and we didn't even know, that would make me extremely nervous. But what culture does for us is it's so defined, it's gated, it's protected, and yes, people might stumble into a crack, but we're going to pull them out and we're going to get better as an organization. And that conversation, I just thanked that lady and said, thank you so much for letting me know, because if you didn't let me know, I wouldn't know that this had happened, and we're going to get better as a team because of what you brought to me. And so those kinds of conversation lead us to address our culture.
So Dave, how do you see culture work out on the negative side? If you're not intentional, if you're not pouring into your team for this, how have you seen culture sort of bite the church, open up those big gaps and work terrible?
You know, some people say that all healthy things grow. The reality is that healthy and unhealthy things grow. So when I think about unhealthy things that grow, I think about the weeds in my front yard, guys' toenails, that's just unhealthy growth right there. And so in reality, cancer grows. It's unhealthy. And so I think what makes healthy culture growing different is the intentionality there. And when you lack intentionality with your culture, you are going to have an unhealthy culture. And what happens in unhealthy culture, what I've come to recognize with that, is that this is when leaders lack intentionality, and what they tolerate is systemic in the organization. So if they tolerate a lack of respect, or if they tolerate a culture that is title driven, that it's a hierarchy and authority and dominion and power, that all of a sudden everybody's going to be in the organization using their title and trumping others with, do you know who I am? Do you know what I do? What my responsibilities are? And so things begin to unravel and become unhealthy when those leaders lack intentionality and they lack taking the step. And I think when I think about unhealthy culture and how that's even impacted our church, and I'm sure other churches, is, you know, we live in a world that social media has opened up the door for people to express what they're against.
Yeah.
And we, for a while, some people were using their social media outlets on our staff and high capacity volunteer leaders in a way that was in a tone that was different than the tone of our church, our heart. And so we started talking about, we wanted to be known as a church what we're for, not what we're against. And so I think churches sometimes are become so adamant about what they're against, whether it's a Supreme Court ruling or what's happening in a political campaign, or what's happening in our world and across businesses, that they're raising their voice for what they're against. And now the church is being seen as bitter, hypocritical, racially insensitive, or whatever it may be. And so we want to encourage, we had to begin to encourage really a culture that was saying, hey, we want to be known what we're for.
Yeah.
And so just even changing those tones. And you've seen unhealthy culture organizations. I think about a couple years ago, this whole report came out about Amazon and how the Amazon culture of the employee was one of the worst places to work for. They had a culture issue, right? They had to fix some things because some things were unhealthy, and they got better. And you think about a healthy culture in the business world. You got Zappos that just while that Amazon was falling down because of their culture, Zappos culture was being talked about and expressed in those ways. And you know, unhealthy culture. You don't go to a restaurant that you had a bad experience with the server or the wait staff or the hostess. You can tell when you're around that bad culture. And here's the thing, I think sometimes church leaders, we go, okay, we're going to set vision, but we put vision on top of toxic culture. We put values, new values, on top of a bad culture. And we can't start with the vision and values. We've got to fix the culture, and the culture has to help develop the vision and the values. I think that's what's going to make it healthy.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So just sort of as we close and thinking about culture, are there any last things or thoughts that you have that you'd want to encourage us just on this subject to learn and to grow, and things that, you know, you've learned from your experience?
I think part of this is you can't measure what you don't monitor. And so I think some people, a lot of church pastors, we talk about measuring nickels and noses, right?
Yeah.
How many noses were in the building on Sunday, and how many nickels came in the offering? There is so much more to measure. There's engagement to measure. There's serving to measure. There's baptisms and salvations to measure. Yeah. But I also think there's values to measure. There's vision to measure. There's culture to measure. And so I would just make sure that there's a dashboard somewhere in your world where you are actually measuring the culture of your church, the kind of place that you want to be, how you're teaching culture, how you're reinforcing that culture. If you're the CCO, that chief culture officer, who's your number two? Who's the second one on your team that's the chief culture officer? And how do you get 3 and 4 people? How do you get multiple people coming, stirring in your mind when you think about the people who kind of lead that drive for culture for you? And then, Dan, I put together just a couple questions that might be good for reflective as you're thinking about culture in your organization. So, Is your culture clear, and is it defined? I began this interview today talking about it's hard to define but easy to experience. Yeah. But when we talked about those organizations, Disney, they've defined their culture. Chick-fil-A, they've defined their culture. Christ Fellowship, we've defined our culture. Yeah. Del Rey, Redemption, you've defined your culture. That culture has to be defined. And then, is your culture building a healthy culture, or is your culture eroding the church from the inside out. And this is what happens. It's a small fade, right? Sometimes you don't recognize it before it's too late. So the question is it building or is it eroding? And this is not about the exterior results. This is about interior, heart, right, of your team, the soul of your team, what's happening there. And then again, just how are you measuring it, making sure that you've got a way to measure culture in your organization. For us, that means it's coming out in reviews. We actually are giving out guest surveys, and so those guest surveys help us measure what people experience when they come to our church. And that's what we're trying to measure to help people. So
with those measurements, how do you measure a value or the culture in that sense? Like, can you give us some examples of what that looks like?
Yes.
Because, we measure the butts in the budget.
Yep.
Right. But what are some other things that you look to for culture measurements?
So we are going to look at those guest surveys. So we ask people, what's the first thing you noticed when you came onto the building, when you came onto the campus or came to the church? And how people respond to that question is very telling. Now, that doesn't give us an exact measurement on who that is, but if they go, man, I recognize that it was really hard for me to find a parking spot. Well, for us, that would go, man, we have a culture. We want people to feel at home. We want them to have a great experience. And it's more than just a great church experience. We don't want a bad church experience to inhibit or block them experiencing the presence of Christ, right? Experiencing the presence of the Holy Spirit. At the end of the day, what we are concerned most about is what happens in the moment of the service where the Holy Spirit's drawing them in. But if they're coming in, bad parking experience, bad children's check-in experience, nobody said welcome home to them, nobody held a door open for them, that kind of stuff matters. So that guest survey is one way that we measure that. And then our stories of transformation every week. My favorite day of the week at Christ Fellowship is actually Wednesday. It's our staff meeting day. We bring all of our team together across all of our campuses. We meet here and we tell 2 to 3 stories every week of the win of what God's doing and the transformation that's happening there. But what we're looking for is people, their statements that they make, like the person that says it feels like family, or the person that says, man, I love the heart of excellence of Christ Fellowship. We have a leadership value that our excellence increases our influence. And so when people start talking about how we care for our buildings and how we care for people and all that, they start talking that when we share those stories, we go, oh, we're winning. We're winning because the culture is catching on for people. Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing, man. Thanks for being intentional, knowing just how to define those things and help us to define culture, because it is important as leaders that we pay attention to these things and we steward these things well. I think sometimes we forget that culture is played out through people.
Right.
We're to steward people and disciple them and point them to God. God has a culture.
Yep.
He's a loving God.
Yeah.
And sometimes people forget about this, but He's defined who He is in the Word of God.
Yep.
And we can actually measure, are we walking in light? Are we walking in love? These type of things.
Yeah.
And so, although you didn't have a Bible verse,
no, but Paul is my CCO in the New Testament. You know what I'm saying? He's the chief culture officer. Totally. You know, he's going to tell you how to live and how not to live. It's all in there. But you're going to bring a lesson, or you've already brought the lesson by the time we watch this.
The thing is so many times, especially with this podcast, we want to talk about the practical application of God's Word. And so, we want to be able to, as church leaders, not just hear the Word of God, but to apply it.
That's right.
To make disciples.
Yeah.
And that's being apprentice of Jesus, walking in His ways. And Jesus is the best culture maker ever, man.
Yeah.
He actually snatches people from darkness into light. There's a verse. But He loves us. He cares about us.
He does.
So now, because He makes things new, we're walking in His ways, and we need to actually process it, plan it out. So I appreciate you helping us process culture, process how do we actually measure things accordingly, and being intentional and just doing those things. And like I said, man, I love Christ Fellowship. I love all you guys are doing. I love you, Dave.
We love redemption and what's happening there.
And so we appreciate you listening, and thank you guys so much just for learning about culture with us.